Welcome back to our video series ESG, Acronym to Action. We discussed the governance in our last video, and I want to now continue on with the theme of governance, but we're going to equip it for action today. This is about governance structured for action. And we're going to talk about the difference between another acronym and the acronym ESG, because there is a very important distinction. HSE versus ESG, well, sometimes the easiest answer is not always necessarily the right answer. There's very significant differences between the term HSE, health, safety, and the environment, and ESG, environment, social, and governance. And what often happens is in organizations, sometimes even larger organizations, the concept of ESG is passed on to the HSE department. Now, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily on the surface, as long as you're addressing the issues. And obviously, we've had a video journey together, and we've discussed a lot of topics in terms of what ESG means. But HSE is really one part of it. We're going to talk about that today. Compliance is the main part of HSE. Health, security, and the environment, okay? These are very, very important items in any company's operational platform. They're a must. So when we talk about health, we're talking about the guidelines and the rules and the regulations for healthy environments for people to be working in. That's critically important. Safety. Well, that becomes a critical issue, especially in terms of companies and operations that are doing any work in the field, that are doing work that requires driving, any heavy equipment and machinery that's involved. And let's face it, there's a lot of industries that do involve the working with heavy equipment and machinery. And then also at the end of that, we see the environment. Now, okay. The environment, you said, well, that's what we're talking about with ESG. Okay, in a way, but where it really comes down to is in HSE, that E is for environmental regulation. And so we see the key word for HSE is compliance. ESG, as we have discussed throughout our video series, involves collaboration. And so collaboration becomes the real important factor here, where we're bringing together the ideas behind environmental action and social action and the concepts of corporate governance and the action that we need to take in terms of that. So this is a really important distinction, because ESG is about imprinting, like we have discussed this before in our previous videos, it's imprinting ESG as a philosophy and as a belief system in how we're going to operate our companies. It's imprinting it on our corporate DNA. It has to become part of who we are and how we operate. HSE is truly about the compliance methodology that we need to go through in our companies to ensure that we're complying with the regulations of different organizations which we may belong to in terms of professional organizations. There's the standards set by the government. There's often standards set even by community standards. There are issues in and around that. And all of these things become part of the rules and regulations for governing our operations. Those are absolutely critical, but they're really basically the bare minimum. What we find with HSE, that's the things we're mandated to do. We have to do them. Everybody has to do them. They're part of the law or the regulated practices that we have to go about in running our operations. So when we start at that point, that's really the bare minimum, the foundation, if I might say, of our organizations has to be that compliance piece. It has to be the layered in foundational principles behind the health, safety, and environment regulations that are guiding our operations. Now, ESG, as we say, being imprinted on our corporate DNA, part of our corporate philosophy, part of our operating beliefs and how we know that we want to operate into not just the present term, but ESG focuses on how we are going to operate into the future. And that's where ESG focused growth really requires the will to go further, requires the will to go further above and beyond. Obviously, that's a term that we use often, right? We're going above and beyond the compliance foundational principles and rules and regulations that have to be there. And we're bringing about a new future vision and an operations trajectory that's going to match to that vision. And that's where that becomes very critical. That's where ESG takes a real different turn from HSE. We're still focused on HSE to ensure that our companies are compliant, but ESG puts us on a pathway to the future with a growth trajectory and an operations trajectory that wants to move in a forward momentum with vision and strategy into the future. Now, it's very important though, critically important in fact, that HSE communicates, collaborates, coordinates with ESG. That absolutely becomes critical. We have to make sure that our ESG department or our ESG team within our organization is coordinated, let's say daily or certainly on a very, very regular basis with the HSE team. The health, safety, environment regulations must be there, must be part of it, and like I say, set the foundation and the bare minimum. That then requires a coordinated effort on the part of your ESG team to come in and ensure that the direction that the company's moving forward in is completely coordinated between rules and regulations and, like I say, that future vision. HSE regulatory needs to coordinate with ESG and make sure that all the compliance issues are not just met, but that the compliance issues are up to date and that your compliance issues that may or may not be resolved are resolved in a timely fashion, because basically if the fundamental rules and regulations, the operating guidelines are not being met, then we can have a really great ESG strategy on paper and a great presentation and it looks fantastic. But if we're getting penalized over here because we're not meeting our HSE regulatory targets, that doesn't matter what we think about we're going to do in the future. We've got a real problem here, and that's where we can end up with issues. All the documentation as well needs to be coordinated with compliance. And that's also very critically important. If we're going to be making announcements or press releases or discussing what the vision is in terms of ESG, we have to make sure that all our documentation, our fundamental and foundational documentation, is coordinated to match to where we are in terms of what we're releasing to the public for information. Again, we've had this conversation before. The proliferation of social media makes these documents and things that are required, they're often posted on government websites. The government makes sure that they post compliance documentation. And if somebody wants to really cause an issue with our companies or our organizations, we have to make sure that we're not missing out on that paperwork. And it's very easy to say these things. It's a lot often harder to do them and to carry them out in practice. But that's why it becomes so fundamentally important to ensure that there's communication and coordination between these two very important parts of our operations. And obviously, in keeping with all of that and the concept behind collaboration, and especially with ESG, ESG is a collaborative response. And it requires us, it demands of us that we ensure that we are in tune with regulatory bodies. So obviously that's our compliance issues. And our HSE, we have to be in tune with our communities where we're operating and working in. And we need to be proactive with the response that we have to the issues and concepts behind ESG that are so critically important for us if we're to move our companies forward into the future. So this boils down two very important, distinct things that need to be coordinated together. They need to be communicated together, but they also need to be understood as two very separate parts of our organization that have to be considered to be priority. And if we don't have the foundation of compliance, we are not going to be able to have a true visionary ESG statement that's going to guide our companies and organizations into the future. And so I'm trying to point out today that we can talk about governance, we can talk about changing our documentation, we can talk about doing all of that, but if we have not coordinated that between these two departments or groups within your organization, then there will be issues in terms of having to address that. Better to be, like I say in the last point there, better to be proactive with our ESG response and have to come back and maybe revise some things than to be announcing a bunch of stuff and making a commentary, especially in the public domain, and then find out that your compliance side is not matching up to that. That can cause, obviously, some real problems. Governance is a critical part of the ESG acronym. And I trust that today, with this video, you've seen how you can begin to put a very solid piece of that governance side into action. We need to structure our organizations for action, not just for discussing the concepts behind governance. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks.